Believe it or not, a lot of you are drafting the wrong running backs in fantasy football right now. And in this video, we'll be breaking down, similar to what we have done the past 5 years on YouTube, who those guys are you should be avoiding, and instead 5 players you can take in their place instead. Now let's start with Travis Etienne, because he's a 3rd round running back who right now has one of the best roles in football, but he's not being drafted like that. And I should put the disclaimer that he is not one of those guys you need to stop drafting. Instead, let's look at some of the guys going ahead of him, because these are the guys who fall into that category. As of right now, I see a guy like De'Von Achane, who I know has a ton of upside. I understand that fully. I see guys like Kyren Williams going ahead of him, and in my opinion, this is just wrong because these guys' roles are not nearly as secure as Travis Etienne, who goes after them in drafts pretty often. I mean, first off, when you look at 2024, the projected workload for Etienne shouldn't change. He should still see a great role. And if I pull up the fantasy blueprint that a couple thousand people have access to for this year, this is just one of the pieces of the tools. We can look at the overall touches last year. You can see total touches with receptions and overall carries. Christian McCaffrey and Rachaad White were 1 and 2. After that, Travis Etienne. He had the 3rd best role if we're talking just overall workload and volume and how much touches you're going to get amongst all running backs. Now, when you see this type of increased role like last year for Etienne, you're going to see a drop in efficiency. The more touches you get, the more bangs and bruises you have. It's hard to stay efficient, which is why he ranked 34th in yards per touch last year after being one of the most efficient backs back in 2022. So in Etienne's defense, naturally you see a drop when you see more touches in your efficiency. And last year, his offensive line ranked 31st. Only the Chargers had a worse offensive line in terms of run blocking last year, and this is obviously not going to help the running back stay efficient. But despite the poor offensive line and not the greatest favorable offense at times last year, he was still able to put up 1,000 rushing yards, almost 500 receiving yards. He had nearly 1,500 total yards and 12 touchdowns last year. Also was a great pass catcher, the 6th most receptions. I mean, he delivered in all different categories. And now the competition entering this year is practically the same. They drafted a late round running back who was like a backup at Texas last year in college, not really a threat, in Keelan Robinson. I mean, the only threat right now is that his own head coach, Doug Peterson, Travis Etienne, has just been saying stuff like this: I would consider knocking a few of those reps to keep him healthy throughout the season, of course, taking down his workload. Okay, so instead of getting 20 touches per game, he goes to 17 or 18, but he's maybe more healthy and efficient. That's not a bad thing. And this is a totally different quote from months later that Doug Peterson once again said. You can see there's a video on Twitter, Coach Speak Index. It's a pretty good Twitter account. I've referenced it a lot, but you can see right here, we want to keep him as healthy as you can throughout the season. He's talking about maybe giving him a few less touches. Again, this isn't a bad thing. People will read into this, they'll requote it, they'll hype it up as if, oh my God, Etienne's role is going to drop now. And even if it does, it's going to be by 1 or 2 touches per game, which is interesting because he goes after a guy like De'Von Achane, who I know has the NFL record right now for yards per carry, his efficiency. But let's look at what his role was last year. His role was 9 carries per game, right? This is a guy who was injured or missed games or on the injury report for 11 different games last year because he's a little bit smaller in size. Those hits ended up adding up. I do believe I have him ranked as a top 12 running back this year because of his upside. But if we're talking about what his floor is, it's a little bit shaky because of the injuries and because of the fact that I don't see a world where he's going to be averaging 15 to 16 carries per game unless he puts on massive size, which is hard to do in one off season. I mean, there's a world where Travis Etienne is earning 2 times as many touches per game as De'Von Achane this year, and even if Achane is insanely efficient, that's hard to overcome. But I do recognize if you just want to take the upside on the Achane in this offense and his speed fits really well, we saw it happen last year. He averaged 7.7 yards per touch, absolutely insane. I understand that. There's nothing I'm going to say other than the fact that yes, he is a little undersized. You can see right here, 188 pounds. Hopefully he comes in this year closer to 200 pounds. If he could add like 5 to 7 pounds of muscle or more this offseason, we shall see. But for me right now, you're getting a guy in Travis Etienne who averaged over 16 fantasy points per game last year, was 3rd in overall touches, and entering this year has really no threats of competition and maybe an improved offense. Finally, Trevor Lawrence maybe breaks out. So I would say to stop drafting De'Von Achane if Travis Etienne is still on the board. And now the next guy I want to talk to is right here in about the end of the 1st, beginning of the 2nd rounds, and I want to highlight this right here. Saquon Barkley currently goes after Jahmyr Gibbs in drafts, and this doesn't seem insane, but Jahmyr Gibbs is going at the end of the 1st round, early 2nd round, and I believe this is a massive mistake. Okay, maybe massive is a little blown out of proportion, but you get what I'm saying. It's just interesting to see people disinterested in Saquon Barkley, or relatively disinterested compared to some of these other running backs, even though he's in a much better situation now. I mean, this is a guy who got 70% more guaranteed money than any other running back in free agency, and you can see you had Howie Roseman, the Eagles general manager, on the Pat McAfee show. He's also been on a couple other spots and interviewed and basically said it's hard to get a difference maker like Saquon Barkley at the running back position. He views him like a Christian McCaffrey, a guy who's worth that much money, who's worth potential draft picks or paying him 70% more guaranteed than any other running back. He's going to have a massive workhorse role. This is the Eagles. The Eagles who don't like spending at the running back position the last decade and then said, oh yeah, Saquon's the guy who's worth spending on. I mean, we're getting a 230-pound running back. Yes, this guy's 233 pounds on his last weigh, and we're getting a 233-pound running back who can run all 3 downs, can pass protect, can catch passes, and now he's going to be in an offense where he's in a top 10 offense behind a top 10 offensive offensive line, when last year it was a bottom 10 offense and a bottom 3 offensive line. This is likely going to be the best situation of his career. I mean, he has rarely been in a situation on an offense where he's leading in the fourth quarter and can actually get an extra 5 to 6 carries to milk out the clock and pick up 30 plus yards and maybe a touchdown. And in more recent years, his offense just hasn't been good enough because of the playmakers, Daniel Jones getting hurt last year, to actually get to the red zone, so he suffered there. But despite all of these downsides that I just mentioned, Saquon was still able to finish top 5 2 years ago and top 10 last year. And in these seasons, he was coming off of injuries, he was battling injuries, he was still able to get to 10 touchdowns because he's scoring from 20 plus yards out because he has that dynamic ability. And now you're going to pair it up with an offense that led the NFL last year in red zone carries inside the 5-yard line in the Eagles. And I get the concerns that people are pointing out. Jalen Hurts, a mobile quarterback, he has 10 plus touchdowns on the ground rushing, at least 10 plus in the last 3 years. Last year with 15, 13 the year before that. So people are saying this is going to take away from Saquon's ceiling. I understand where people are coming from with that, but I just don't believe it. Because these are the red zone carries for DeAndre Swift last year. He had 41 red zone touches while splitting a backfield. That was top 20 in the NFL. Again, while splitting a backfield, while 2 or 3 other running backs and Jalen Hurts were involved in the red zone, he was still top 20. Now Saquon's going to come in and be the clear running back in this backfield. I think Saquon easily ranks top 10 in red zone carries this year. Wouldn't be shocked if he's top 3 to top 5, pushing towards 60 plus red zone touches. And the other concern I hear people saying is, what about the receptions? A mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts, he's not going to target his running backs. Well, once again, last year in a split backfield, DeAndre Swift had 39 catches, Kenneth Gainwell had 30 catches. Those 69 catches would have ranked easily top 10 amongst running backs last year for backfield receptions. Saquon, I believe, is going to take on a complete role between these guys. Yes, some other guys like a Kenneth Gainwell or a rookie Will Shipley will be involved for some receptions, but I believe Saquon probably hits 50 with ease, upwards of 60 to 70 receptions, which would be in that top 5 range. That's how talented he is. And he has a new offensive coordinator in Kellen Moore, who has past success at targeting running backs like Tony Pollard and Austin Eckler in recent years and loves to use his playmakers, 3-down running backs in the offense as much as he can. And to put a little bit more behind the Kellen Moore information that we just talked about, Jared Smola adds a great stat here. You can follow him on Twitter from Draft Sharks. He says that Kellen Moore has had 5 offenses that he's coached. All 4 have ranked top 4, so top 5 as well, in pace and situational neutral pace. Last year, the Eagles ranked 18th. Now, what does this mean? What do we mean in terms of the nerd talk? Usually last year, the Eagles are about an average pace in terms of running a lot of plays. That's what that means. But Kellen Moore has always ranked top 5 in plays. He likes to run a lot of plays. And when you're running an extra 5 to 10 plays a game on offense, that's going to add up over the year, especially for your workhorse running back. So when I see a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs go ahead of Saquon Barkley in drafts, I start to get a little bit questionable in terms of like maybe the projections say that, but overall upside, you have a guy in David Montgomery in this backfield. He's going to steal red zone touches. He's going to play minimum 40% of the snaps, if not more, and also steal some carries. Where Saquon Barkley, I'm not concerned Kenneth Gainwell is going to do that. I'm definitely not concerned Will Shipley, a late round running back out of Clemson, is going to do that. I mean, there's a world where Saquon Barkley could earn 100 more touches than Jahmyr Gibbs this year and even have more receptions or similar receptions to him, and he's going after him in drafts. Now let's shift our focus to a running back who had one of the best roles in all of football last year and now goes in like the 4th or 5th round. But before we get there, let me just quickly tell you about the Fantasy Blueprint. Look, it's as simple as this. I've talked about it all summer so far. Do you want to win your fantasy league and use the tools that I use in all of my drafts, which is about 250 plus if we're counting best ball? If you want to use those tools that I use and 10,000 others have now used and are currently using, well, all you have to do is come to this website. It'll be linked down below and you click get access, and you can get access, listen up, for risk-free this year, meaning that if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, you pay absolutely nothing through one of our 2 partners below when you go to this website. Risk-free through our 2 partners. It'll have all the tools you need to help you dominate your draft, and every single week of the season, I'll be sending you tools. Now, what are those tools? It can be anything from rankings, projections, waiver wires, matchups, all of that and more. And again, it's completely risk-free if you sign up through our partners. If you don't make your fantasy playoffs, you pay absolutely nothing. You can sign up right now, joining the 10,000 others who have access to my tools and material. Scan the QR code on the screen or click that link in the description below. Now, to that running back who currently goes pretty often in round 4, that's where he's going right now, and I want to talk about him. It's Rachaad White. He goes as the 43rd overall players in drafts, and honestly, I think he's being taken just after guys that he shouldn't be. Now, look, a guy like Isaiah Pacheco, I think, should go ahead of him, but a guy like Josh Jacobs, I like Josh Jacobs. I think the landing spot with the Packers was fine. Shouldn't be going ahead of Rachaad White. And if you scroll a little bit further down here, you can see guys like James Cook are basically going in the same range. Heck, even Kenneth Gainwell or Kenneth Walker goes in the same range pretty often. These are just guys that I'm not as interested in taking compared to Rachaad White. And again, this is not to say that James Cook and Josh Jacobs are bad players or bad fantasy picks. It's relative to Rachaad White. I actually think those guys are going overlooked by a lot of people as well. But I showed you this blueprint touches page earlier when we were talking about Travis Etienne. Well, number 2 on that list in touches last year year with 336 was Rachaad White, only 3 behind Christian McCaffrey for the best overall role in terms of volume in all of the NFL in fantasy football. And it's like now people don't even care because his role was elite last year and he took a step forward as a receiver, leading all running backs in routes run and catch rate. Now, White did have a lot of benefits last year in his breakout season, the former 3rd round pick. I mean, obviously he had the big workload, but then also this right here. He ranked number 1 in light front carry rate. So on average, he was not seeing a lot of stacked fronts. People weren't, you could say, maybe scared of him. Baker Mayfield threw downfield a lot to guys like Mike Evans, so they maybe played a little bit more be outside of the box and had their guys back a little bit, the defenses. And by all accounts, this helped him become a relatively efficient running back compared to years past, where he averaged 4.6 yards per carry, around average to slightly above average, because Baker was throwing downfield. Again, people were focused on that. Now, here's the deal. People will say, well, that can't hold up. The light carry rate is not going to hold up, but here's my question for you. What's going to change in this offense now? Now, I know they have a new offensive coordinator coming in, but in terms of their personnel, Mike Evans re-signed, Baker Mayfield re-signed. Apparently, they're going to use Chris Godwin in more creative ways. I think they're still going to be targeting these guys downfield. And then there's the fact that they didn't sign any key running backs in free agency, and the only running back added in the draft was Bucky Irving. You can see Bucky Irving right here. He was taken in the 4th round, so not like a priority, a 2nd or a 3rd round pick. It's not like they traded up for him. And here's the deal with Bucky Irving. This is a guy who probably is going to come in and be the RB2 right away, but I wouldn't be shocked if Chase Edmonds still gives him a run for his money, because I do think Bucky Irving is a little bit overrated if we're talking about what he did in college, and we can pull it up right here. Overall production-wise, yeah, back-to-back years at Oregon of putting up over 1,000 rushing yards. You factor in his receiving yard usage of last year, having 53 receptions, almost 400 receiving yards. Yeah, this guy is piling up a ton of stats, but here's the thing people don't talk about. He wasn't efficient in college. Like, he had 53 receptions, but this was an offense led under Bo Nix that was known for checking the ball down. The guy was averaging like 6 to 7 yards per reception, which is pretty bad for a running back. He also wasn't the most special runner, and then he goes to the NFL Combine and he runs a 4.55, which if you're like 220 pounds, that's a pretty solid time, but he's not 220 pounds. He's 192 pounds. So he's an undersized, slower running back. Again, relatively speaking, he's faster than me. He's bigger than me by like 30 pounds. I say undersized. He's bigger than me by like 20 to 30 pounds, but we're talking relative to NFL running backs who find success. This is not the model of that. And I stumbled upon this tweet that kind of sums up the situation here by Guru Fantasy World. I thought it was a pretty good idea. It says that Bucky Irving is this year's Tank Bigsby, a guy that was getting maybe some hype because there wasn't a lot of other competition to be the RB2, but maybe not the greatest runner or profile coming into the draft, just getting a little overdrafted. Last year, Rachaad White, his rushing woes that people were concerned about not being efficient, he goes on to point out that maybe, look, he was the most efficient runner on the team last year. Maybe it was due to their poor offensive line. And I think there is something to that. Obviously, the offensive line, which we'll touch on in a second, how they've improved that. But if we're just trying to compare the situations from other guys who were going around him, like we talked about earlier, Josh Jacobs is on the Packers now. But the way that they set up this contract, it's just a one-year deal that they can get out of if they see something in Marshawn Lloyd, who's one of the first 5 running backs taken in the NFL draft, has size, has more size and speed and quickness, and maybe even broken tackle ability than a Josh Jacobs. And A.J. Dillon is still there, who will factor in for, a couple of carries a game. And as for James Cook, again, a guy that I like, but relative to Rachaad White, what do we know about his role? He's going to be great inside the middle of the field, but once you get inside the 20s, Josh Allen will be there. They didn't trust him last year. They gave the ball to a bunch of veterans. Now they signed a bigger 4th-round running back in Ray Davis, who was a great red zone back in college. Ty Johnson started having some success last year. I'm just a little bit concerned. Do we see James Cook have a year where he can have a 10-plus touchdown season or a reliable one inside the red zone? I'm just questioning that compared to one Rachaad White. And now I touched on this earlier. The biggest issue that I'm concerned about is Dave Canales, the former offensive coordinator, is gone, and he's replaced with Liam Coen. And we've had a couple of quotes so far from Liam Coen about Rachaad White. The best one so far is saying that he's taken every detail that we've coached throughout this offseason and he's applied it. He said other things about how this guy has the build to be a workhorse back. Like, Dave Canales was the guy who fell in love last year with Rachaad White. He faced him when he was on Seattle, and he said this guy is great. So there's no doubt about it that Dave Canales might have had a little bit of bias, but also was watching the practices every day, and that's what Liam Coen is going to do as well. And I think that is probably going to have him standing out more than Bucky Irving, just size-wise and explosiveness. Now, I mentioned earlier another potential concern is the offensive line. Well, they kind of addressed that in the draft, drafting 2 different offensive linemen, including a first-round center out of Duke, very athletic player here, and Graham Barton, a guy who can play multiple different positions. They also added a couple of free agents in free agency. We'll see what happens there. But I do believe this is something that has to change. The offensive line has to stay better, not only for Rachaad White, but the whole offense. Baker Mayfield, once pressure comes, things can get bad. All right, now let's talk about the debate in the first round between Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall. And depending on the day that you're looking, Bijan will go before Breece and vice versa. As of this day right now, Breece is going ahead, but it's like a 50-50 right now in drafts, which means I think that 50% of you are probably making the wrong decision. Because as of yesterday, Bijan Robinson was going ahead of Breece Hall, and although it is mostly a coin flip, like if Breece Hall is gone, I'm still fine taking Bijan. If they're both there, you want Breece Hall. Now, these guys have pretty similar profiles profiles in terms of two young dynamic backs who are in improving offenses that are getting their veteran quarterbacks now back from an Achilles rupture. But if I do have to pick one, I want to be going with Breece Hall here, because in his second season, after coming off of a torn ACL, he goes out there and leads every single running back in receiving yards, with his rushing yards at about 1,000. He has nearly 1,600 total yards, and in his final 12 games of the season, so after a couple weeks to get ramped up off the ACL injury, he ends up averaging over 100 yards per game and was a top 3 running back in fantasy. And he did this without having Aaron Rodgers and running behind the Jets' 27th ranked offensive line that has since improved. Breece Hall led all running backs last year in not only receptions, but also broken tackles. And I think this role is going to just remain this year, because the only competition, the new competition that was added, was 2 later round running backs, a 4th round pick in Braylon Allen, and I believe a 6th round pick in Isaiah Davis, who actually led every single running back in rushing yards last year. But here's the deal. I don't think Braylon Allen's a threat. Right now, he's standing out early on. This can change by like the week in camp or even by the preseason for sure. I think he's a very interesting player, an extremely young player entering the draft, just 20 and a half years old right now, 235 pounds, was very productive at Washington, kind of a raw runner, but is standing out. But here's the problem. He's just a backup running back right now, right? When we talk about guys like Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, we're not concerned when a 4th round running back enters that backfield. Christian McCaffrey, right? That's the type of upper echelon talent and ability that we just saw last year from Breece Hall. These guys are not threats. Whereas in the backfield for the Falcons, I am a little bit more concerned. Again, I'm not dying concerned. We're trying to split hairs here in the first round when deciding between these guys. But Tyler Algier is a guy as a 5th round rookie 2 years ago who rushed for over 1,000 yards, set the Falcons running back rushing record as a rookie that year. Last year was still involved for 12 carries per game. I do believe Bijan Robinson, after everything the new coaching staff is saying, is going to see more than the 12 carries per game he saw last year under Arthur Smith, but it's at least worth pointing out that his competition, Tyler Algier, is legit compared to unproven competition in the backfield with Breece Hall. And if you're not familiar, I did mention they do have a new head coach in Raheem Morris, and the big one here is the offensive coordinator in Zach Robinson, comes over from the Rams. This is a guy who was there during the time of the Todd Gurley years under Sean McVay when they just leaned on one running back. He was there last year when Kyren Williams was healthy and they just leaned on one running back. So I'm not shocked to see Bijan Robinson, an uber talent, become a guy who starts to see 16, 17 carries pretty frequently this year. Again, we're splitting hairs here when we're talking about the competition in this backfield. And another way to split hairs is to talk about the competition for targets. Bijan Robinson, when we're talking about his pass catching ability, it's definitely there. I mean, we saw him last year in a somewhat limited role go out there and still put up the 3rd most targets with 86. But this year in a new offense, Drake London's going to be massively involved. Kyle Pitts is probably going to be more involved than he ever has been. But when you compare that to what the competition for targets will be for Breece Hall, it's really just Garrett Wilson. I'm not concerned about whoever their slot receiver will be, or Mike Williams on the outside, 30 years old, coming off a torn ACL. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Jets had a bottom 5, 27th ranked offensive line last season. Well, this season, they've done every single thing to improve that. Draft with their 1st round pick, a top 10 overall pick, Olu Fashanu, a tackle. Yes, they lose Mekhi Becton and Lincoln Tomlinson, which honestly aren't really concerns. You get John Simpson, Tyron Smith, who they signed. They trade for Morgan Moses, who was a solid player for them just a couple of years ago. So you have 4 new offensive line pieces, potentially 4 new starters on this offensive line. I believe only things can get better from there. And you don't even have to be a top 10 unit for Breece Hall to be great. He was great last year and you were a bottom 5 unit. Just be average, protect Aaron Rodgers, keep him healthy, and Breece Hall, in my opinion, has a real chance to finish number 1 overall in all of fantasy. And that's exactly why on PrizePicks, I've currently taken him for more than 999.5 rushing yards. I mean, this guy had basically this number last year, 994, with everything working against him and coming off of a torn ACL. So that is one of the reasons I put him into this one PrizePicks entry. There's other ways you can play this as well. We'll talk about another guy who I have in that entry. If you want to check it out, it's linked down below. We'll put a QR code on the screen right now. They'll actually give you a free entry up to $100. They'll match your first deposit on PrizePicks. There's a bunch of season-long props. I'll be discussing them on my other platforms and this one as well, so you can check them out. It's a lot of fun, just other ways to kind of get some action down outside of your fantasy matchups every single week. Because obviously you can't draft all these players, but if you like Breece Hall, it's another way to get your favorite players or your favorite teams that you can get some action on throughout the season. Now I want to talk about a middle round guy, because we've talked about it. This range of the draft right here, right around round 7 is where it starts with DeAndre Swift, James Conner, and it goes down to like round 10 if we scroll a little bit all the way down to this range. Brian Robinson, Trey Benson is like round 10. This range is filled with great running backs. If you get one running back early and then you can secure like 2 or 3 of these guys, I think it's great. But as of right now, there is a guy that I want more than anybody in this range as of right now, and his name is Jaylen Warren. So these guys, James Conner, DeAndre Swift, Zach Moss, the guys who go ahead of him in certain ways, certain builds, I think they're okay picks. Moss more than Conner and Swift, but they should not be going ahead of Jaylen Warren, in my opinion, right now. And again, somehow Zach Moss is being drafted ahead of him. These guys could not be any different. Jaylen Warren is actually the younger, explosive upside player in his backfield who can catch passes, whereas Zach Moss is like, okay, if you need 3 to 3.5 yards, he'll get you it, but that's about it. And maybe I'm being a little bit unfair if you need 3.5 to 4 yards, but you're not getting these crazy explosive runs or anything from a pass catching rushing standpoint out of Zach Moss, at least consistently. Now, Warren plays for an offense that last year led the NFL in neutral run rate. When the games were close, they were running exactly 50% of the time, the most in the NFL, and that should only continue this year based on all their offseason moves. For starters, the team drafted 3 offensive linemen, Troy Fautanu, Zach Frazier, and Mason McCormick, with their first 4 picks, including their first 2 picks on offensive linemen. And then you look at what they did this offseason. They don't have Deontay Johnson anymore. They really didn't replace him. A 3rd-round wide receiver in Roman Wilson here, a bunch of ancillary receivers in Van Jefferson, Scotty Miller, Quez Watkins. So your number 1 receiver is gone. You beefed up your run blocking game, and you still have 2 solid running backs in Najee Harris and also Jaylen Warren. And not to mention, you go out and sign your offensive coordinator. You say, I want to get a guy out of our organization, and it's Arthur Smith. And Arthur Smith ranks 2nd as a coach the last 4 years with the Titans and Falcons in run rate when the game is close. And then meanwhile, you have Zach Moss, who is entering a new team now on the Cincinnati Bengals. You can see right here. Again, he's being drafted ahead of Jaylen Warren, and this is a pass-first team. This is a team that added Mike Gesicki and is talking about using him down the field in the slot right now. They added a Jermaine Burton in the 3rd round, an exciting player who led the Alabama offense in college the last 2 years in catches and receptions to replace Tyler Boyd. They still have T. Higgins, who's going to play in the franchise tag. Jamar Chase, who by the time you're watching this might have got paid by now. They're going to be a pass-first team. They've ranked top 10 in pass rate the last 2 years. And not to mention, last year, Warren, when in a split backfield, still ranked 5th in running back targets and was able to earn 24 red zone touches. So between his 24 red zone touches and his targets last year, he had 98 cheat code targets, which was top 20 in the NFL. This was more than one Zach Moss had, and of course, he was backing up Jonathan Taylor, but I think that there's a decent chance that at some point this year, he'll be a backup for the Bengals as well. Whereas I don't see Jaylen Warren's role reducing with a new offensive coordinator there in Arthur Smith. If anything, I think it's only going to get better as Najee Harris ages and Jaylen Warren enters year 3. After last year, you can see where he ranked according to on Twitter right here. A friend of mine, Joe, he points out that he was an elite rusher. 3rd in yards before contact. Okay, that's only going to get better with some more offensive linemen out there. 1st in broken tackle rate, shows how efficient he is. 1st in evasive rate, shows how agile he is and potentially explosive. All that comes down to is that this guy was able to pick up a ton of yards before and after contact, and now the situation in terms of running the ball in Pittsburgh has only gotten better. And not to mention, last year he played less than 50% of the snaps. Again, that was a split backfield with Najee Harris, and he was still able to finish as a top 30 running back when only scoring 4 touchdowns. So even if his role doesn't change in terms of snaps, he still plays 50%. He remains efficient, if not more efficient, and this goes up to 7 or 8 touchdowns, which it probably should based on how good he is and how often he's getting red zone touches. Now you're looking at easily a top 20 running back who goes outside the top 30 backs right now in drafts, and after Zach Moss, who I don't think has anywhere near the type of upside as Warren. Because I can see Warren overtaking Najee Harris. He did last year in the receiving game. Now all he has to do is average an extra 3 to 4 carries per game, and there you go. He's the running back 1 on the Steelers. Whereas Zach Moss is on a brand new team. He has to earn his role. I do think they'll trust him to pass protect for Joe Burrow, who's coming off of another injury to his wrist, or a wrist surgery. But Chase Brown, if he can prove that he can pass protect, Chase Brown is a guy compared to Zach Moss who is insanely more, let's say athletic. You can see right here, speed, burst, according to Player Profiler, strength with bench press, is a better pass catcher, is arguably a better runner, especially in terms of after contact, where Zach Moss is just a guy who is kind of like your average backup running back, can pass protect, get you 3.5 to 4 yards. There's a lot of ways where he can lose his job to Chase Brown. And that's exactly why I added him into this play here that we talked about Breece Hall earlier. I'm taking Zach Moss for less than 749.5 rushing yards. We talked about this earlier in the offseason. This number was above 800. It's already dropped by 50, and I still think it's a good play because I think there's a world where Zach Moss is playing the first 4, 5, 6 games of the season, and Chase Brown quickly starts to take on the starting role, and then Moss is not even seeing 10 carries a game the back half of the year. I think there's a world where that exists. Again, you could take this exact entry. I put 20 to try and win 60 here if both of these hit, and you can check it out on PrizePicks. It's linked down below. There was a QR code on the screen earlier, but the whole point of this entire video was to say, stop drafting awful running backs. Again, the word awful might be a little blown out of proportion, unless we're talking about Zach Moss, and even then it's blown out of proportion. These guys are NFL running backs who are getting paid millions of dollars. I understand that, but relatively speaking, compared to the other guys going ahead of him, you guys are drafting the wrong running backs, or at least people in your league are. Let them continue to do that. You don't want to be doing that. But what you do want to make sure you're doing, and that sounds weird, do what you're doing. What you want to make sure that you're doing is in the later rounds looking for the league winners. That's what you actually want to be doing in fantasy drafts after round 10. And this video points out 7 of those players who can actually win you your leagues in the later rounds.